Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I wanted to continue our discussion on the judgment. In our last video we saw that the investigative phase of this judgment concludes with the second advent of Christ. In Revelation chapter 22 we read the declaration that denotes its completion. Verse 11 says, "He that is unjust, let him be unjust still. And he which is filthy, let him be filthy still. And he that is righteous, let him be righteous still. And he that is holy, let him be holy still." It is only after this pronouncement is made and the work of investigation completed that we read in verse 12, "Behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to give every man according as his work shall be." It is then that Christ returns to take his people, that where he is, there we may be also. And at the return of Christ, we saw that the living saints are translated without seeing death, while the righteous dead are risen and partake of the resurrection of life. We read in the book of Luke that they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead, neither can they die any more, for they are equal unto the angels, and are the children of God, being the children of the resurrection. And Revelation chapter 20 and verse 6 tells us that blessed and holy is he that had part in the first resurrection. On such the second death hath no power, but they shall be as priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. And so after being taken from this earth, we are told that the saints as priests reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now this is very important to take note of, and we will look into this 1,000-year period in a moment. But in verse 6 we see that a blessing is pronounced upon those that take part in the first resurrection. The use of the word first implies the occurrence of a second, and the Bible does speak of two distinct resurrections at the end of time. The book of John tells us in chapter 5 that the hour is coming in the which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. And so there are two resurrections. The first resurrection, that is the resurrection of life, this we have seen takes place at the second advent of Christ, and on such the second death has no power, we are told. But there is also a second resurrection, the resurrection of damnation, and this is what we want to look into now. 2 Thessalonians tells us that at the coming of Christ, the wicked that are alive to witness his return are destroyed by the brightness of his glory. But we are further told in Revelation chapter 20 that they, together with the wicked of all ages, remain in the graves until the 1,000-year period that we mentioned earlier is finished. We read in verse 4, "And I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished." This is the first resurrection. "Blessed and holy is he that had part in the first resurrection, and such the second death hath no power. But they shall be as priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years." And so the wicked are not resurrected at the second coming of Christ. The saints are taken to heaven at that time, and reign with him there 1,000 years. But of the wicked it is said in verse 5, "The rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished." And so there is a 1,000-year period that exists between the first and the second resurrection. And during this time we are told in verse 4 that judgment was given to the saints. Of this Daniel also references. In chapter 7 and verse 22 we read, "The Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High. And the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom." And so the Bible is very clear that judgment will be given to the saints, and as we've seen, this takes place during the 1,000-year period that follows the second advent of Christ. But who is it that they judge at this time? Well, the cases of those written in the book of life have already been investigated and determined prior to the coming of Christ. So that leaves those whose names are not written therein as the only cases that are yet to be reviewed. And so this judgment concerns them, the wicked of every generation, those that never yielded to the promptings of the Holy Spirit, those whose names are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life. The judgment of this class has been termed the Millennial Judgment, on account of the fact that it takes place during the 1,000-year period. It is to this that the Apostle Paul references in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, when he says, "Do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are ye unworthy to judge the smallest matters?" And Jesus himself also speaks of this time when the saints shall sit in judgment. In Matthew chapter 19 we read, "Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me, in the regeneration when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, ye also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." And so the redeemed in union with Christ will judge the wicked, comparing their acts with the word of God and his law. Then the portion which they must suffer is determined according to their works, and it is recorded against their names in the book of death. But not just the wicked of earth, Satan also and the evil angels are judged by Christ and his people during this period. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, after saying in verse 2, "Do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world?" Paul continues in verse 3, "Know ye not that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? And so the saints not only judge the wicked of the world, but the fallen angels also." Jude references this in his book in verse 6. We read, "The angels which kept not their first estate, he hath reserved in everlasting change under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day." And so the punishment of all, both men and angels, are determined in this millennial judgment, and the saints fulfill their role of determining the sentence of all those that are numbered among the lost. Another thing worthy of note about this 1,000-year period is that Satan is said to be bound for its entirety. We read in Revelation chapter 20, "And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed a little season." And so Satan is said to be bound for 1,000 years. And the expression bottomless pit represents the earth in the state it will exist in at that time. In the beginning, the Bible states that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. The word here translated deep is the same that in Revelation chapter 20 is rendered bottomless pit. And Jeremiah prophesying of this time tells us that the earth will be brought back, at least partially, to this condition. We read in Jeremiah chapter 4, "I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord, and by his fierce anger. For thus hath the Lord said, The whole land shall be desolate, yet will I not make a full end." And so alone with his angels on this desolated earth, Satan is to remain for 1,000 years, there to behold and contemplate the results of his rebellion against God. As he is limited to this world, he will not have access to the other worlds to tempt and annoy those who have never fallen. And there being none upon earth upon whom he can exercise his power, he is completely cut off from the work of deception and ruin which for so many centuries has engaged his attention. It is in this sense that he is bound. Since his fall, his life of unceasing activity has banished reflection. But now in the absence of this activity, he is forced to contemplate the part which he has acted since he first rebelled against the government of God. Now he must silently, for 1,000 years, look forward to the time when he must suffer for the evil he has done and be punished for the sins that he has caused others to commit. At the close of the 1,000 years, Jesus again returns to the earth to execute the sentence that has been determined during the millennial judgment. In Revelation 19, we see that Christ returns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And John chapter 5 tells us that he was given authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. At the return of Christ, the second resurrection, that is, the resurrection of damnation, takes place. He bids the wicked arise to receive their punishment. And as he does this, there comes forth a numberless host, as the sands of the sea. But unlike the redeemed 1,000 years prior, the wicked raised with the traces of sin and death upon them, and not the perfection of immortality. Revelation chapter 20 reads, "But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished." And verse 12 says, "And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them. And they were judged every man according to their works." At this time Satan is also loosed, and as he sees the wicked resurrected, as he sees the vast multitudes upon his side, his hopes revive, and he determines not to yield the contest. He marshals the army of the lost and leads them against the saints to take possession of the city of God, but he will not succeed. We read of this conflict in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 7. It says, "And when the 1,000 years were expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and he shall go to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city. And then we read, And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. Verse 14 continues, And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. In the very next chapter we read in verse 7, He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the fearful and unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars, shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. And so this is the execution of the judgment, and it marks the end of the great controversy between Christ and Satan. Sin and its author, together with those that have allied themselves with the enemy of God, are destroyed. Fire is said to come down from God out of heaven and devour them. And so the single dark spot that has marred the creation of God is finally removed. The earth is recreated, and the universe is made eternally secure. We read in Revelation chapter 21, And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself shall be with them, and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And so we all have an opportunity to be there, to experience a life that is without death, without sorrow and pain and suffering, one that throughout eternity would be marked by peace and happiness. But to be there will cost us something. It will cost us all that we are. We will have to sacrifice the things of this life. The pleasures of sin will have to be given up, and we will have to take our stand on the side of Christ. My prayer is that this may be considered a cheap price to purchase eternity.